What's up, everyone? Welcome. Thanks for tuning in to our Intrigue Media and Morning Brew Learning conversation with the Intrigue Media founders, Helen, Zhang, and John Fowler, both former diplomats, paired with myself, a guy who couldn't even get into Model UN. So I'm sure it'll be a great conversation. Before I intro our guests, let me set the scene. It is true. You can see it. We're here live at the Morning Brew HQ studio, and we're really growing up. We're glowing up here. My name is Kyle Hagge. I'm the Director of Community at Morning Brew, really focused on our education products. You probably know Morning Brew from our newsletter or our podcasts or our 12 other newsletters, but we also have an education arm, a Morning Brew Learning. We've been moving out of the inbox, and we really want to partner with you as a career concierge. We want to help you achieve what you want to achieve, when you need to achieve it, in the form you want, through our various experiences. We have now built multiple cohort-based courses. These are anywhere from 1-week sprints to 4 to 8 week accelerators. We've graduated over 2,400 professionals from these courses, which is pretty remarkable. It's quite fun. And we have an awesome alumni community, many of which are tuning in now. So what's up, y'all? Our next course is a 1-week course on data storytelling. This helps you make dashboards that deliver. We have done the impossible, and we've made dashboards sexy. I don't know how we did it. We pulled it off. We also have a 7-week course on business analytics starting May 1st. So if you like this conversation, if you like the vibe, check us out for our learning experiences and more information at learning.morningbrew.com. So now let's actually get into the people we're here to see. That is John and Helen, co-founders of Intrigue Media and the newsletter International Intrigue. John Fowler is a former diplomat with postings in Beijing and Shanghai. He wanted to maybe jump back into the private sector. So he got his MBA at the London Business School. Then a small thing called COVID happened. Maybe people have heard of that, which turned a lot of things upside down. He called his friend Helen, and Helen Zhang is a former diplomat with postings in Tel Aviv and Hong Kong. I've been told that she's a better Mandarin speaker than John. Maybe that comes up during the conversation. Helen is now the director of International Strategy Forum. International Strategy Forum at Schmidt Futures, and is obviously the co-founder of Intrigue Media. She's a 2020 Fulbright scholar and has a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. They tell you to never be the smartest person in the room. I'm definitely nailing that today myself. So John and Helen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for having us. Thank you for making data sound sexy earlier as well. My gosh, I want to sign up for the course.
Right. Well, hey, it's open. We do our best to make those maybe slightly boring topics fun, engaging, approachable, as you do with international news. So before we get into Intrigue Media, I first want to set the record straight for what diplomats are and your past experiences. When I hear diplomat, I think James Bond, or I think a person sitting in a cubicle only sending emails, and like nothing in between. But I know the truth is somewhere between those extremities. So what is a diplomat, and what did you two do individually in that capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Everyone thinks and wants it to be James Bond, but it is much more sending emails. The way I used to, it's a famously hard thing to describe. I think the way I used to describe it when I was in China was you're kind of like an investigative journalist, but for the government. The government's your audience. So, think about the things you might do if you were a journalist in China. It's kind of like reporting on conversations you're having, the economy, the politics, that kind of stuff, meeting with academics, society, and you're writing cables back to your capital.
What are cables, John?
Well, thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, most people are like cable news, like you're...
Exactly, yeah. So that's a good point. Cables are kind of like the fancy word that diplomats use to try and pretend it's not just a report, just like a news article. We call it something special to make sure everyone thinks that they couldn't do it. And then, the other part of being a diplomat is sometimes your capital will say, go out and meet this person and ask them these questions because we need that information. So that's the kind of best way I've been able to describe it. And one of the less glamorous things is you have to do a lot of visits too, which is when you have a senior official from your country coming to the country you're posted in.
You're like their tour guide.
You get the ice water.
Like the baggage handler, right? You get the ice water, baggage handler, get the dry cleaning, and then you're the sort of like chauffeur for trying to figure everything out. Spending a lot of time dealing with other ministries and officials, and feeling like, is this what I did my law degree or my arts degree for? Right?
Yeah, not James Bond.
Yeah, not James Bond, basically. Yeah. But I think, you're also an extension of the government, right? So you're a representative of your country in that particular country you're posted to. So in some ways, you're always acting in your official capacity when you're representing at functions or meetings or getting out there on the streets and attending things. So, yeah, I mean, I think it can be quite fun depending on where you are.
Yeah. Well, I like one already takeaway is don't call the report to your boss a report. Call it, boss, I have a cable for you.
Get someone sexy.
It's going to
Exactly.
sound a lot more intense. What drew you both into this field originally? Was it like service to country? Did you want to see other parts of the world? Like, what made you interested in this field in the first place?
Well, we're both patriots, Kyle. I mean, for me, I'm a first-generation migrant to Australia, and I think for me, I joke about this, but there is an element of feeling like I wanted to give back to the society and go into the public service. And then secondly, I was just very curious about the world beyond Australia, right? I think Australia is, as we now know, a very big and far away country from the rest of the world,
right?
And can feel very isolated sometimes. So for us, or for me anyway, it was a great way to sort of get out and see what else is out there.
Yeah, I think apart from the migrant bit, it's the same for me too.
Oh, you're not?
No, I'm
News to me.
Yeah, right. There aren't many jobs where you can say that my career will have me in 5, 6, 7 different places, and also places that you can't go as a civilian. So for my sins, I was a lawyer for about 18 months before I packed it in because I couldn't hack it. And you can move to London, New York if you're good and you manage your career well, but you can't move to places like Baghdad or
Colombia.
It's a lot harder, right? But with the Foreign Service, the whole point is that you do things like that and they teach you to speak a language. And that kind of opportunity always struck me growing up as just like, why wouldn't you do that if you could? Yeah.
And so, I mean, it resonates with me as well. I think you've just outlined some of the incredible perks of working in the Foreign Service as a diplomat. And when I think of that, again, like you just articulated, it seems really cool. You're meeting cool people, you're having important visits, you're meeting with dignitaries, you're representing your country. And then I think of writing a newsletter. And it's a different, obviously this is Morning Brew, it's great, but it doesn't sound as cool as that or as sexy as that. So walk me through the thought process of going from that life to founding Intrigue Media and kind of doubling down on this international Intrigue newsletter.
Yeah, I think it's a great point because it's something I've grappled with. I left the Foreign Service at the end of 2019 and, as you said, did my MBA. But it's something I've grappled with, this idea that you lose status. And the amount of conversations that I've had where you say, I used to be a diplomat and now I run a newsletter. People go, why? Like, what's wrong with you?
Did you get fired?
Did you have a breakdown? Exactly. But I think the lesson from that is you've got to figure out who you are. And my personality just doesn't really vibe well with giant bureaucracies. I get frustrated with decisions that don't get made quick enough. And, that's not a problem with the bureaucracy per se. It's the fact that the match wasn't great for me.
Right.
Yeah.
And so rather than kind of just be, when you're in a big company or a big government or whatever it is, you see a lot of people who don't take charge of their decisions and they end up 40-year careers not very happy, not very they're not bringing themselves to work, they're not doing great work because they're not engaged. I could see myself kind of going down that route, so I was like, okay, I got to get out of here. And then Intrigue Media came around because I was in business school and COVID hit and things just, there was that sense in the world that the world was coming back to life after the fall of the Soviet Union and the kind of, I don't want to say peace because obviously there's been a lot of conflict around the world, but relative stability around the world. There was a sense that was changing, and a lot of my colleagues in business school didn't kind of grasp what that meant and why. And these are the kinds of folks who are going to go and lead companies and be consultants and bankers. So we thought, I called Helen, as you said, and I thought, I think there's an opportunity here maybe to communicate to the next generation of folks what's happening, what it means, and what you can do about it.
Right. And I think part of it is also just while we were working in the Foreign Service, you see how much geopolitics impacts all aspects of national security, the economy, every sector that you can think about, and impacts people's lives. So I think we want to explain that to people in a more digestible, entertaining way in which they can then gain relevance from and understand how it applies to their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very similar to Morning Brew. Like,
you guys have been a big influence on us.
Yeah,
Huge,
let us tell you what is happening so you can make better decisions with your career, in your life, and you can kind of stay apprised of what's going on. And obviously international news is the same thing. If you know what's going on, you're going to be able to make better decisions. So before, I want to get into some of like the lessons learned, both from your diplomatic career, but also what you're learning building this business. But first, just at a high level, because we've talked about Intrigue Media and the newsletter, like, what is the newsletter? What what can people get in the newsletter? How often does it come out? Like, set the scene of the business.
Go ahead.
Well, so it's a daily newsletter. That's the cadence from Monday to Friday. And in it, we kind of take you around the world on sort of the top hitting stories that you need to care about at the intersection of technology, business, and geopolitics. Because it's largely global affairs, right? But there's nothing really out there that hits that intersection and tells you the so what, right? And our tone is quite, I think quite funny. It's been described as expert but irreverent because we really try and make it entertaining and engaging for the readers. And we also cover the entire globe rather than just focusing on the so-called global north, as we've discussed before. And we're apolitical because we're former diplomats and we try and make things just very factual and taking away really concise little nuggets of information that you can then use at dinner parties to say, hey, I know this thing, don't I sound smart?
Yeah, exactly.
Or to your bosses, actually. That's probably more relevant.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, Helen's nailed it. I think the one thing, too, is we've got another colleague who's a former diplomat as well. So we bring kind of like not a journalist's eye to it where they might be sort of more focused on the what happened, but we do a pretty good chunk of like what this could mean, things that you might not have thought about and how they're connected. So a bit of value add there as well.
Yeah, giving people insights that can guide future decisions.
Yeah.
And I love the newsletter. I love the tone as well. And I think it's just a great lesson for people. Like when I hear the word cable and probably the reports you were sending, I imagine they're pretty dry.
Right.
And unreadable. The information itself can be so impactful, but if you're not able to connect it to your audience and deliver it in a way where they're engaged, which just means they're actively participating in the reading, it's lost on people.
Totally. And I think that was one of the kind of lessons I learned from my MBA was like, these people aren't stupid. Like they're going to lead the world in their industries. Why aren't they engaged with this stuff? And it's exactly that. It's like there's nothing out there, or there wasn't anything out there that was, easy to read but engaging and made people want to come back while telling them what they needed to know. And I think, again, being a lawyer, there's this element of like when you have a knowledge economy job, you want to put up the barriers so that no one else can do it, so that you can keep your job.
Right.
And I think geopolitics and foreign policy is very much one of those careers where people go, I've worked really hard to get here, so I got to make it really hard to understand and make sure that people don't realize that anyone can kind of get across the issues.
And very elitist. And
exactly.
So I'm very excited about these next parts. I want to kind of get into some advice for listeners based upon your experiences. And I want to break it down in three kind of buckets. The first is consumption. You have had to read a lot of news in your former job. You've had to read a lot of news in your current job, and determining like what's important, what's not, how to just sort through all this news and kind of keep signal and noise separate. Very interested in that. Then I want to talk about communication. So once you've consumed all your news, how do you effectively communicate that? How do you think about different like stakeholders and who your audience is? And then I want to talk about general career advice because you've both had fascinating careers. So let's start with consumption. I know that you were like famous diplomats for like analyzing 600 plus news sources every single day. The one diplomat I knew would read the paper in like 6 different languages every single morning, and I was like still doing a crossword just like in one.
That's incredible.
And so like, how do you think about combing through so much news? I mean, I think news now is like infinite. You can read everything from every corner of the world. You can go on Twitter and just lose yourself. How do you think about consuming news, understanding what's important? Like, what tips do you have for people listening?
Yeah, I think you've put your finger on the problem, right? Like the digital media environment is a fire hose and no one can really drink from it. So I think, the way I've kind of explained it to folks who don't kind of work and live and breathe in the media is, it's like any data set. If you had a whole bunch of numbers in an Excel spreadsheet, you need to kind of organize the landscape, the context. You need to put in columns and rows and formulas and all that kind of stuff. But because it's news and it's kind of in language, we don't think about that meta kind of organization. So I think the first step is to understand the media environment and what is actually going on. So you've got a story that comes across your desk. Be a bit critical about how you think about that story. So is it a discrete event? So like one event that is going to boom and then fizzle and never be important again? Is it a continuous event like that's going to keep going for a year, 2? The Ukraine war might be a great example of that right now. And that is your first sort of understanding of like, do I need to pay attention to this? Is this going to matter in 1, 3, 5 days? Or is this something that I'm going to take the information from and put it on a shelf because it's part of my broader understanding of a bigger issue. And if you can think of that initially, that helps you kind of do that first initial sort of like ignore. And then the next thing is the understanding that the half-life of every news story roughly in the world, and this is kind of just based on what we see, is about 5 to 6 days. So most stories, once they hit let's say they hit the front page of the New York Times, within 5 to 6 days, they will certainly not be in the New York Times, but they won't be in a lot of other sources as well.
Right.
They'll be filtering through the tail of like blogs and like stuff that's more think piecey by then. But that's most stories. Obviously that, it changes. But if you kind of know those two facts, you can start to be a bit more critical about not what you're reading, but the context of what you're reading. So when we think about the newsletter, that's the first thing we do. So you mentioned we've got 600 sources. We'll go through and be like, interesting story, but in 5 days, if we read this, would we care?
Right.
And I think a good example of that might be the leak story that was last week. The guy from
The
Massachusetts.
21-year-old from
Right.
was he the Navy Guard or maybe Coast
Air Guard, yeah.
Air Guard, yeah.
It's a perfect example of where it gets quite complex to make those decisions because one, it is a discrete event, right? Like he leaked it, he got arrested, and it's not in the papers anymore. It's about 6-7 days ago.
Right.
But it is also part of a much bigger story, the Ukraine war. We learnt lots of stuff about what Egypt was doing in Ukraine and other countries were doing. And it's a bigger story about US spying and all this kind of stuff. So in that situation, we'd say, yeah, it's a discrete event, but we should pay attention to it because it tells us stuff about other things. So I think that's the kind of first thing that you have to. There's that famous David Foster Wallace quote of like the two fish swimming in the ocean.
Like, what is water?
What is water,
Yeah.
right? And that's kind of what the media environment is, right? So you have to approach everything with that idea of like, I'm swimming in news, but you aren't in the news, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
If you can get out of that.
You're not the news.
Yeah, exactly. You can get out of that and assess it. And there's lots of tools, that we don't have time to go into that you can think about, but that's the first step, I would say.
That's
Do you have anything to add to that about how you kind of source stuff?
I just get my news through TikTok. No, I'm just joking. But seriously though, that is definitely something that I think increasingly will be changing how people consume news, the sort of pure video format. But there is a lot of things that you see go onto TikTok that doesn't make it into written news that I think is quite interesting.
Well, I think the fundamental thing there is people are looking for quick, short snippets of information that means they don't have to pay attention to everything. I think one of the mantras that we repeat internally at Intrigue is that being a news junkie doesn't mean you're well informed.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The idea, like, if you can go to a dinner party and be like, 10 things happened today, but you don't
Yes.
know really what the purpose of understanding those things are, then what are you doing? You kind of just, it's sport then, really.
Yep.
And I think, to your point about TikTok, I'm not on TikTok, but I think it is interesting that people.
Despite my best efforts, yeah.
Right. The algorithm, though, the idea is that it tells you what you need to know. It's trying to tell you what you need to know, and you consume it rather than having to go out and find it and make all these decisions yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that's a good thing, but
And you consume more of the discrete news that you were talking about rather than getting the context of the longer term pieces.
exactly.
Yeah.
And what do you think a takeaway for someone who is listening to this and is like, I understand this from a news perspective. That makes sense, but my job, I don't need to know what is going on in Australia, for example, but I'm dealing with a bunch of sources to make the best decision I can at my job. Like, do you have any general strategies that are applicable to professionals about how to comb through what they're encountering and just think a little more critically, something you picked up as diplomats or something you're experiencing now?
My general solution to that stuff, I don't know yours, but is to try to be much more conscious. So for me, that kind of generally means like stepping away from a computer and writing down a few things. So if I don't know, let's say I was a supply chain manager in a company and we had supply chains in India and China, I'd probably go away and just be like, what do I actually need to know? What are the things that that would come across my desk that would meaningfully change how I think about my job, what I need to tell my bosses or whatever it is. But doing that in a kind of a removed way, so you're kind of approaching it with a goal. Like, if you're an athlete, you don't sort of just turn up and run around after the ball. You've got a process, you've got a plan. We should really consume what that's the kind of food of the mind. We should consume it in the same way.
Right.
So I think that's a pretty good start. And there's lots of tools, but it's just that idea of don't just wake up and mindlessly scroll through your habitual stuff because you're just not going to get anything out of it. Be more intentional about it. I think that's the key. And then I think the second thing is to have the confidence to just ignore stuff. Like,
Right.
Yeah. Learn how to say no, basically.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that it applies to our attention. Like, unplug, safe in the knowledge that anything that you miss is probably not going to be important. As long as you've done your conscious like news curation, you feel like you're, not going into things blind, then ignore the rest, because that's a big part of it, is this idea that you're never done. You're never done knowing stuff.
Yeah.
But you can overdo it and kind of confuse yourself and waste your time.
Yeah. And part of that is also like stepping back and then mapping exactly what the key stakeholders are, who the key players are, what you need to know. And that applies in any organization, right? In any work that you're doing. And then triaging according to those preferences and those needs, so you know how to filter your work and how to prioritize it.
Yeah.
I think that's been really important, because everything is very reactive and on the job. I'm sorry, I'm clicking. But you have to really figure out how to work through that and sift things according to urgency and priority.
Yeah. I love that advice, and I love this idea of writing as well. I feel like when I read the news or when I gather any insight that would be relevant for my job, I'm like, oh, I get this story. I've read one tweet, and then I'm like at a party, and they're like, "What do you think of this?" And I say something, and they're like, "What about this element?" And I go, "Oh yeah, actually, I don't know this at all." And I think we have the illusion maybe that we know, and I love people that can write, because it forces you to really calcify your thinking. And so that is my advice for any professionals: like, get it out of your head, get it on paper, force yourself to deal with the fact that you might not know as much as you think,
Right?
And that's where you understand your gaps and can go a little deeper.
Real quick, if you're forced to write something out about something, you will be like, oh god, I actually have no idea what I'm talking about.
It's a perfect way to identify gaps. So let's move into communication. So we just talked about consumption of news. I love the advice. Now you're sending a newsletter out to tens of thousands of people every single day. And Helen, you talked about your tone earlier.
Yeah.
And having a tone that is smart, it's witty, it's irreverent, and there's a reason you do that. It's to connect with your audience. So what advice do you have? Or before advice, like, how did you come up with that tone for International Intrigue, and why did you think it would connect with your audience?
That's a great question. I think to answer that question, part of it stemmed from the fact that this is how John and I talk naturally
that's true.
anyway. And so in some ways, it's sort of playing to that authenticity. Well, it's not playing to the authenticity. We are being authentic. And I think that really connects with readers, because, as we go sort of post-media, legacy media, a lot more of our readers and people out there consuming news want authenticity and connection with the person who is writing. And so part of what we did initially was a weekly Substack, and John and I have promised each other to just write one article each week and really let our voice come out. And so part of that was being playful with how we were able to tell the news and how we could connect with our readers through being very witty, or trying to be very witty and smart, and talking to them rather than talking at them.
Yeah, I love that. Don't try to be something you're not.
Absolutely.
Because now I think authenticity is something that can't be replicated by AI or can't be scaled.
Exactly.
And so it gives you this advantage.
Yeah.
And it's a magnet for people that want to be spoken to like that. John, what is your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I also... I'm a big believer in, like, if people give people what they want, and people don't want to be lectured, they don't want to have to. It shouldn't be work to kind of keep on top of the stuff you need to know. And I think I'm a big believer in humor generally. I mean, I'm not a great purveyor of it, but
you consume lots of it.
Right, exactly,
right,
I do.
Right.
And like,
I grew up on The Simpsons.
I grew up on The Simpsons. But also, like, stand-up comics are incredible communicators. Like, you can remember if you like a stand-up set and you've laughed, you can remember what they said, like, almost word for word, one or two times into it, right? Because there's something about the humor that is, like, memorable. It sits in your brain. You want to consume it. You're active. You're engaged. And so, it's difficult to be funny while you're talking about the news, because you have to be very careful about particularly, global stories where most of them, unfortunately, aren't great pieces of news. So you have to be very judicious with it. But if you can put in some throwaway lines, some interesting, engaging things, people remember it and they want to come back to it. And I think that was again, it was the NBA when we started experimenting with a weekly Substack. We got great feedback from people, because they were like, it's not like anything else I read, and I enjoy it because I'll get a laugh and I'll learn something.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I love this point about stand-up comedians.
Yeah.
Maybe like a takeaway is, like, communicate like a stand-up, where it's not just what you're trying to say. It's not just the universal truth you're trying to get someone, but you're very thoughtful about the arc of the story you take them on.
Yeah.
And keeping them engaged every bit of the way to deliver that truth. So Everyone should be more like stand-up comedians.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
Is the takeaway.
Agreed.
Building humor as a weapon.
Yes, yes. And the other thing I want to talk about is communication under stress. Now, I think the word stress probably has a different meaning for me than it is for two former diplomats. I think of stress and I'm like, I have a meeting in 30 minutes and like I got to finish this report. You're probably like, am I being watched by a foreign adversary?
Right, there were rockets overnight.
Yeah, so I think you're the stress experts. So what advice do you have for people to communicate through stress or in stressful situations?
We were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, we were
right?
talking about this earlier, and I think you know you're being self-deprecating. I think the stress reaction is it's the same. It's still cortisol. It still makes your heart beat faster. It still makes you not make great decisions. So like it doesn't matter what the stress is, it's still got the same reaction. So I would say that it's relevant to everybody, even if you think your job isn't particularly important. But the first thing, I mean, we take a beat. That's it. Just like. There is I can't, unless you're a trauma surgeon, in which ignore this advice.
Do not take a beat.
Exactly.
In the ER.
Or a cop or something like that.
Yeah.
Exactly. But there's almost nothing that will be better by you reacting like in the absolute moment. Like maybe that timeline is a bit different for everybody. Maybe you have only got a minute to kind of take a beat, or maybe you can go for a walk for 15 minutes and take a beat. But that idea of just like as whatever perspective you can get on a situation before you communicate, do that. I think that's the key. There were a few situations in China that got pretty stressful, pretty hairy, and I think I learned it the hard way that you can make things a lot worse if you just go bang and react straight away to something. And again, nothing got worse. It didn't always get better, but nothing got worse if you just went, I need 5 minutes. I'm going to go sit in my desk and just go. You don't even have to think about what you're about to communicate, but just a few deep breaths, and your brain clicks back into being relatively okay, and then you're away. So I think that's the first thing about communicating under stress is just prepare yourself to deliver the message you're going to deliver by taking a moment.
And rocking back and forth in
the fetal position.
Fetal position,
exactly.
I would say also, in addition to that, is just being action oriented and going straight to the so what and what can I do right now. I think when you're in this stressful situation, often you get bogged down by a lot of extra details that perhaps you can strip back. But being action-focused and telling the person who needs to know this decision how they should make that decision and how you can move forward and have a path through progress is probably the most effective in that sort of environment.
I love that. It's like focusing on your locus of control. What can I control right now? I don't need to think about the fourth or fifth domino that's going to fall.
Exactly.
What do I need to do now? Take a beat, think about that, and then come up with some action plan. And I love this idea of taking a pause. We talk about having parachute lines in like difficult conversations at work or difficult conversations in general. Like, hey, I'm having a bit of an emotional reaction to this. I want to give you a more thoughtful response.
Exactly.
Let me take 5 minutes. I'll be right back, and we can continue this conversation. Something as simple as that, just to give yourself some space, can be incredibly powerful.
Yes.
And there's no situation in which that doesn't make things at least the same, but it almost certainly makes them better, right? No one's going to be like, no, you can't have that 5 minutes.
Actually, I want a less thoughtful answer now. Yeah, no one's going to say that. I love the tips on communication. Let's talk in general career advice, because I feel like you're two of the people I've met with the most interesting careers. So let's first talk about jumping from public sector to private sector. I think sometimes we have this idea that they're very different. What has your experience been going from a diplomat to, starting your own company? Key differences and any similarities that surprised you as well?
Well, there are certainly less cocktail functions to attend, sadly. So John keeps me on.
They're not functions. I just have them at home. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think one thing I've learned that surprised me is that actually the tradecraft of diplomacy is very transferable, and that is something that I hadn't necessarily thought about. What I mean by that is sort of a lot of the skills that you have as a diplomat in terms of interpersonal skills, communication skills, analysis skills, they will be relevant in no matter whatever career you go into. And so that's been really helpful for us in terms of translating that into building a business and building out contacts and stakeholders and building an audience, actually, right? And communicating effectively.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you kind of touched on it earlier when you said like that kind of jump isn't something that a lot of people do,
right?
And they don't understand like if you can do it. And
Right.
I think you made a great point that the skills are very similar, right? But I don't think what we do very well on both sides of that equation is communicate the value to the other side. So like if you're in government and trying to get a job in the private sector, a lot of private sector folks will be like, well, that's not relevant to us. You work in the government, that's slow, that's boring. It's like, well, no, I've got the same, exactly what you said. I've still got a boss. I've still got to do my job.
Yep.
And vice versa. A lot of people in government are like, you work in the private sector, you don't understand policy. You don't understand like all the different political. It's like, well, I can learn too. Like the skills are the same.
Yeah.
For me, it just comes back to what I mentioned at the start. It's more about personality fit. I think that not that I regret it, but if I think earlier in my career, like in my early 20s, if I'd been a bit more like conscious, sat down and write something out about like what kind of person I am and what kind of environment I'd thrive in, I probably wouldn't have chosen, a giant organization that moves slowly, and that tends to be government. But
also big corporations.
I was going to say, I
like
probably
tech companies too. Surprisingly, not.
It would have been a
You
mistake.
like a startup environment more.
Yeah, because I think for me it's important to be touching the results and owning the results. And government is very much one of those places where you do a piece of work, often in a silo, and it disappears somewhere, and you go, I don't know.
That
works.
50 years that
Exactly.
has impact.
Whoops.
And exactly. And for some people, that's fine. I'm much more someone who's like, I want to be like, oh, I stuffed up, and we can learn and
Iterate.
move on.
Yeah.
Or I did great, and look what exists that didn't exist before.
Right.
And I think that's the biggest difference between the two. But I'm sure there's people in government who have that experience themselves. It just wasn't my experience.
Right.
Go ahead, Helen.
I was going to say, one of the really important things to do in any job is kind of write out exactly what those tasks are in your functions. And then, for exactly all the things I listed, and figuring out what exactly you like about that job. And I think for both John and I, we really loved the engaging with people, learning about new things. And these things, the curiosity, the sort of learning, the growth mindset stuff, that's all very transferable, right?
Yep.
So if you're in, say, for example, one industry, consulting, you like some things about that role, but you're also interested in other things, then really extrapolate what it is about your existing profession that you enjoy doing, and then find something that's a better fit that, can really amplify the best aspects of you.
I love that piece of advice, and I love this just idea of like career storytelling.
Yeah.
Like whatever you've done,
It's crucial.
no one's going to like connect the dots for you.
Right.
But if you're like, I was in government or I was in the private sector, here's what I did. Here's how I'm going to be a value add going to a different sector because I learned these skills. Like build that career narrative, then it makes jumping a lot easier.
Absolutely. And having the design thinking, right? I know John gets frustrated. I harp on a lot about this, but like being really intentional about designing and building out a career and a life that you want, rather than going on a conveyor belt and saying, well, this is the next thing I do, and then that's the next thing that we should do.
Yeah, be conscious.
Right?
Yeah.
Be conscious, exactly.
Yeah.
So I want to talk now about building a business together as friends.
Are we friends?
And I know that, not everyone is going to start a business with their friend, but you certainly have friends at work, and you have a professional relationship with them. You also have a personal relationship with them. Those two things can get jumbled up sometimes. I'm sure everyone listening is like, I've wanted to have a conversation with someone professionally, but I know them really well personally, and I'm worried that if I have this conversation with them, it's going to affect the personal relationship. So how has it been managing a business together and managing a friendship, and advice for other people in the workplace dealing with that tension?
You made a big assumption. My friend. No.
Yeah.
I'm a bit reticent to give broad advice because I think it's just so dependent on the friendship and the relationship. And I would say I'm very lucky that Helen is a incredibly forgiving, largely agreeable person, because I'm probably not those things. I think the yin and the yang is the kind of probably what makes us work. Is like I can be like, this isn't working, and I'm not happy about it. We need to fix it. And I think your inbuilt natural reaction is to be like, oh, okay, let's fix it, rather than like, hey, don't say that, or like, yes, it is.
Yeah.
And half the time I'll go away and be like, oh, I was wrong, and you'll be like, yeah, but let's move on.
Right.
So but I don't think there's any advice for that. That's just kind of two people. It is essentially a relationship, right? Like it either works or it doesn't.
For better, for worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's to that point, it's transparency, right? And being
very
upfront
honest, yeah.
with each other when you think something's not working, rather than letting things metastasize. Is that the word? Yeah. And
Close
get
enough.
fester, right? And
Yeah,
getting
fester,
and getting really, really toxic, because I think you really need to be able to work with a person and be transparent about how you feel about certain things, and then you can iterate together. But when that relationship breaks down, then it becomes difficult, because then that spreads out to the rest of the team. And so I think we've been very conscious in trying to be upfront with each other and talking talking things through rather than letting them sit on the shelves.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke to transparency just now. You were talking about kind of the brutal truth, or like saying.
Well, I trust her to react, like, honestly. If I'm saying
Yeah.
something, I don't think she's not going to get offended. It's like, yeah, it's truth. The trust that someone's going to receive what you're saying in the spirit it's intended.
Yeah, and we talk all the time about like psychological safety and radical candor, where like you actually
Yes,
leverage
absolutely.
your two's deep personal connection as I know you're going to understand that I'm coming to this with the best intent. I respect
Yes.
you as a person.
Yeah.
So I'm actually going to be more honest with you because I know it's not going to jeopardize our relationship.
Exactly.
And that allows you to move a lot faster, actually,
does.
because either of you can say, hey, this isn't working. It's not personal, but we need to do something about
Right.
it.
Yeah.
So
Right.
turning it into a strength.
But yeah, that's hard to find, right? And I think the challenge that when you asked about building a business is how do you take that dynamic, which I think is a really good one, as you grow. Like we're only a team of 6, but even there's different personalities where you sit there and go like, I feel like if I spoke to some of them like I speak to Helen, there's not that we've got a decade plus long friendship.
Yeah.
I don't have that with some of the team members, so you've got to be a bit more careful, but you still want to make sure you don't get away from the core value of like, I got to be able to tell you what I think without you thinking I'm being a bad guy.
Yeah.
Right. And part of that is also removing your own ego from the
Yeah.
entire thing, right? I think that's a really important aspect that comes probably with maturity, for me anyway, with age and
me too.
maturity, and removing any sort of critique of you from your ego and sort of your attachment to that ego.
Yeah.
So saying, okay, John is criticizing my work because it wasn't up to scratch, right? So I got to fix that. He's not attacking me as a person. And that's something that I think, even articulating that now, I think, oh, obviously. But it's actually really hard to do in the moment when you have a lot of emotions and you're all stressed, as we're talking about stress in the moment. It's cortisol is running through your blood. So it can get hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Remove the ego and understand they're probably talking about something in your role that isn't going well or a task you've done, but they're not talking about you as a person. I think that's great advice. So we're getting near the end, and I want to talk about the future of Intrigue Media.
Yeah.
So right now, I think most people know you for the daily newsletter, but I know you also are playing in the podcast space. Where do you see the business in 3 and 5 years? Do you have new types of content? Do you have new mediums in which you're exploring that content? And what problems are you helping people solve?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you probably know it's kind of like you have thousands of ideas running through your head. I think the one that we're really focused on is this idea that the media industry is kind of moving to the ends of the spectrum. So you've got the New York Times, which you can't really compete with their scale, their resources.
The New York Times and Morning Brew, I think.
And Morning Brew,
two-
exactly.
Yeah.
Absolute
Yeah.
behemoths of the industry. Exactly right.
Legacy media.
Exactly. And on the other side, you've got Substacks. Like it's never been easier for an individual person with a couple of thoughts to get them out there and be a mini media company. And I think everything in the middle between that is in for a tough time because, as you said, you're not kind of conveying that value to folks. Where we think that we can get around that by the idea that there is still value from our time as diplomats. We know there's still value of being in the place that things happen. So the reason the government spend genuinely billions of dollars a year to send people around the world to kind of have conversations is because there is something that you can't replace when you're sitting behind a desktop in DC or New York or whatever it is. Canberra, exactly. So our idea is that because of this Substack revolution that's unbundled a lot of media, what would a sort of a disaggregated network of those kinds of folks all around the world, in Thailand reporting on Thai politics, in, Lithuania doing like some interesting thing on supply chains in Lithuania, what would putting all those people together into a network where you can kind of pull the aggregated information out and create like a global network, a foreign correspondence network or a foreign service as a service, which we like to call it. What would that look like in 3 or 5 years? So yeah, that's kind of where we're heading, is a disaggregated media company around the world.
Yeah, but we've been building out a Spanish-speaking newsletter as well because Jeremy Dicker, who is our managing editor, had spent time in Peru and Mexico and LA and speaks fluent Spanish, and I think we can hopefully help tap into that market as well with Spanish speakers and building out more, quality, enjoyable B2C products.
Yeah, it's very exciting to think about the future of the company, and even now I'm like, I have so many ideas myself. And
tell us.
Yeah, exactly.
They're probably not good. We'll talk offline. I don't want those on the record. But I guess to kind of leave the audience with a nugget, as we've talked about all this conversation, former diplomats, you're now thinking about the world even maybe more so, writing this newsletter.
Absolutely.
And if I'm just someone that's listening to this conversation and I'm working for, a random consulting company in Minnesota, why is it important for me to understand what's going on across the world? Or why should I care?
Yeah.
A simple answer is everything's connected. That's a very glib answer, but I think there's a sense that everyone is getting that in the last couple of years, the world is changing really quickly. I think we said before we came on air that the last 30 years have been relatively peaceful, relatively stable. And I think I'm in Minnesota. Why do I care what's going on in, Iraq or Turkey or Russia or whatever? That's changing. I think the idea that COVID can start somewhere and kind of spread around the world and cause every single person, no matter where you are, to have to feel its effects, then have to deal with supply chain logistics, even if you're in a little distributor in Kansas or whatever it is. And then now the Ukraine war, we're seeing, the effects of energy prices and all these kinds of, everything is connected and it is getting less stable and more volatile. So I don't think I would ever say that someone needs to be like a geopolitical expert if you're a consultant in Minnesota, but you need to have a pretty decent understanding of what, to our whole conversation, what matters and what doesn't. Like, okay, this has just happened, and that's something I don't think I have to pay attention to, but this has happened, and it's in India, and it might not appear like it's relevant, but it could be X, Y, Z because, I know about my business, and you apply all those lenses to it. So I think, the short answer is everything is connected. The longer answer is everything is connected and it's getting less stable.
Right.
Really
exactly.
interesting.
I think the way that world has been set up since the Cold War has fundamentally changed. And so because of that, we've got polycrisis, which is like a term that a lot of...
The hot new term.
Yeah, the hot new term, right? So a lot of things going on all at once that's compounding and impacting each other at the same time. And I think for this person in Minnesota, they want to know the so what in a concise and precise way. So that's sort of why I think we need to tell them that. Right? That's Intrigue Media's hopeful role.
I love it.
And I guess one last point: if you're a consultant, your client is the person you want to impress, and if you don't know this kind of stuff, if you can't talk credibly, at that inch level of depth, what are they going to? They're going to be like, well, I don't really know that you really know what's going on in your brief. So
I love that. So what? Like, it might not be knowing what is going on, but it's knowing the implications of that and like how that's going to why should I care? So I think that is a fantastic way to wrap this. I'm also pumped we got to say Minnesota a lot. I'm from Minnesota, and I'm like, yes. Shout out to Minnesota.
Yeah.
So Helen and John, first, thank you so much for being here, for creating the newsletter, which again I absolutely love. Everyone check it out. And I think most importantly for serving in the Foreign Service, I think that is a very noble thing. It's keeping the world connected, and I think now more than ever we need that. And to the audience, thanks for tuning in once again to one of our Morning Brew Learning conversations, this time with the co-founders of Intrigue Media, John Fowler and Helen Zhang. If you're interested in more Morning Brew Learning opportunities, accelerators, sprints, downloadable templates, you can go to learning.morningbrew.com to find all of that. So thanks for tuning in. And John and Helen, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kyle.
Lovely.